Ever since Nintendo released the NES Mini and it sold far better than they expected, those mini nostalgia-based consoles have become a much-loved way to play retro games in an affordable and easy way. The idea is simple. Buy a small version of a console you loved as a kid with a bunch of preloaded games on them, and plug it directly via HDMI cord into your TV, and boom, you have a collection of retro games at your disposal. For those only interested in playing the games who don't care so much about having a collection or playing on the original hardware, or even those who can't connect old consoles to modern TVs, this is a great means to play some old favorites. With the TurboGrafx 16 Mini now out, it's time to compare these mini consoles and see what the pros and cons are of each one, and which ones might be right for you. While I'm aware that people have found ways to mod these devices so they can add entire collections into them, it's not what I'm going to be talking about. I'm discussing the product as is. If modding is your thing, great, but I just want to take these for how they are off the shelves. The NES Classic Edition was a great mini console with 30 games. While it had many classic console games like the Mario Trilogy, the 2 Zelda games, Ninja Gaiden, Mega Man 2, and others, there was an emphasis on multiplayer and arcade-style games, many of which were from the Black Box collection. While their choices like Bubble Bobble, Balloon Fight, and the 2 Donkey Kong games are inspired and a lot of fun, they also lack the substance that many later titles might have. The strangest thing is that despite the emphasis on the multiplayer experience, it only came with a single controller, forcing the buyer to source out a second controller, an oddly difficult experience if you're seeking the proper functionality that only first-party controllers have. This led to many buyers having to resort to overpriced copies selling on eBay and Amazon from third-party sellers, at prices that are frankly unjustified. I was fortunate to find one at a decent price, but it was a search I feel I shouldn't have had to make, particularly since I got my NES Mini during the second wave of releases, when buyers made their complaints about the console well known. On that note, the controller cord is comedically short, forcing the player to either source out a cord extension or just sit really close to the console, which may not work for everyone's entertainment setup. Nevertheless, at a retail price of $60 US, this console is a great deal. It's no secret that the old NES games are extremely hard, and many adults don't have the time that they had as kids to invest into and master NES hard games. With the ability to create save states at any moment during gameplay, making it to the end of brutally hard games like Gradius, Ninja Gaiden, and Ghosts and Goblins, doesn't seem as unreachable as if you got the original cartridges. The homepage interface is very intuitive, and the music is very on brand for Nintendo. Cute, simple, and catchy. To exit gameplay, simply press the reset button on the console. Later released games like Star Tropics and Kirby's Adventure are not obvious, but excellent additions. I've been playing the original Castlevania for the first time and really enjoying it, and this is my chance to finally play through Zelda 2, which is known to be far less forgiving than the first game. Still, there are many games that could have made this feel even more complete. Missing from here is Contra, and while they have the sequel, Super C, the original is much more iconic in the hearts of NES fans. Similarly, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse, is far more loved than the divisive Simon's Quest, but it is sadly missing from this package. Other great picks would have been Bionic Commando, Blaster Master, and Adventure Island 1 and 2. Or maybe just 2, because that's the one where you get to ride the dinosaurs. While I'm sure licensing complications played a big hand in why some games were not selected, I would have loved to see DuckTales, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, Batman, and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 the arcade game, just to name a few. But regardless, there is plenty to enjoy here, and it is well worth the retail value. The Super Nintendo Classic was a bit of a different beast in its game selections. There were fewer multiplayer games on this collection, despite Nintendo rectifying their mistake and packing in 2 controllers with this one. The controller cords are also longer, but arguably still too short. Also, there's a downgrade in the amount of games, stranding us with a mere 20 games from one of the best video game libraries of all time. making this the mini console on the list with the fewest number of games. That being said, no game is wasted and they are all indispensable. Masterpieces like Super Mario World, The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past, Super Metroid, Donkey Kong Country, and Yoshi's Island are all present, as well as acclaimed third-party games like Street Fighter II, Super Castlevania 4, and Contra 3 Alien Wars. There really is nothing I'd remove here, except maybe Kirby's Dream Course, but even that one has passionate fans, so maybe I just need to give it a bit more time, and it is good to have another two-player game in the mix. The interface is basically the same as the NES Classic with a different soundtrack, similarly on brand, but with more 16-bit sounding music. Of course, the big gimmick of this package was the release of Star Fox 2, the abandoned sequel of Star Fox that was finished in 1995, but left in video game purgatory for over 20 years. The inclusion of this long-lost game was brilliant in finally bringing gamers an official version of the game, so we didn't have to resort to downloading the leaked ROM. In hindsight, it did seem like a missed opportunity for Nintendo to have sat on this gem for as long as they did, but I am glad to see it here. So with only 21 games in total, I would vote for nothing to be removed, but this collection could stand to have even more. It is a head-scratcher that Donkey Kong Country 2 was omitted, since it is the preferred game by many fans. Some shooter representation would be appreciated as well, with popular titles like Gradius 3 and R-Type. Those would be great candidates for this because the save feature would help make them more accessible. Chrono Trigger is also an RPG fan favorite, and ActRaiser, a unique early release of the console, would have also been an inspired choice. But I would have liked to see more multiplayer games like maybe Wild Guns and Pocky and Rocky. While not overly well-known titles, this would have been a great way to bring them to a new audience considering they also command a big price tag for their physical copies. And competitive puzzle games like Bust a Move and Yoshi's Cookie would put those two controllers to good use. But Nintendo went with quality over quantity, and at a price point of $80 US, this was still a good deal. Not just because of the pedigree of the selected games, but also because some of the more expensive picks. In particular, this whole package is cheaper than sourcing out a cartridge-only copy of Earthbound. With the positive response to these mini consoles, both from collectors and casual gaming fans, naturally, other developers want to capitalize on this market. Last year saw the release of the Sega Genesis Mini. Packed with 40 games, Sega was wise to pack in 2 controllers, and the cord length is about the same as the console's original controllers, so you can sit at a comfortable distance from your TV. The menu interface may be the weakest of these consoles, but it is still intuitive and you can select how you want to organize them. But I prefer the closer look at the art like the Nintendo ones provide. The music is fun and goes through movements capturing many different moods of Genesis games. Exiting games is the least intuitive, as you need to hold down the start button for several seconds to exit to a menu. You get used to it, but it's not as fast as I'd like. There are so many great games on this mini console, but with a bit more filler than the Nintendo releases, but I do prefer to have the variety personally. Staples like Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and 2 are of course present, as well as classics like Gunstar Heroes, Streets of Rage 2, Castle of Illusion, Castlevania Bloodlines, Comix Zone, and many, many more. Building off the SNES Classic's big move of releasing previously unreleased games, there are 2 such games. Darius, a shooter that never made it to the Genesis, and Tetris, which was long denied from the Genesis thanks to Nintendo having console distribution rights back in the day. Thankfully, this version of Tetris has 2-player compatibility, something that the NES port lacked. There are some region-exclusive games that were released on the Mega Drive that did not originally end up in North America, like the PAL-released Mega Man: The Wily Wars, and the Japanese-exclusive Monster World 4. The allure of these titles is not only do they have an intimidating price tag, but they are also excellent games. While about the same as the Nintendo mini consoles at costing about $80, it is made more available, so there's far less price gouging from eBay sellers. In fact, it has actually gone down in price depending on the retailer. For my money, this collection is more worthwhile than the Nintendo consoles, and reminded many Sega fans why they were on Team Genesis back during the 16-bit wars. Despite the impressive collection on here, there are still plenty of games that I'd love to see added. Tragically, Sonic 3 and Knuckles is not on here, which seems like a no-brainer to me. Even the Nintendo Classic had all 3 Mario games. Other great titles that are missing are Rice Star and Rocket Knight Adventures. Alien Soldier hadn't made it to the Genesis in North America, so this would have been another great way to get this gem from Treasure to a wider audience. It was odd to omit Aladdin since it was one of the best-selling games on the system, even though they managed to license other Disney games. It was strange that they did not include Phantasy Star 2 despite many considering it a series highlight and a much-loved RPG on the console. And oddly, no Mortal Kombat games are present despite those games being every Sega fanboy's go-to example of why Genesis does what Nintendo don't. And to counter Nintendo's Zelda games, having Crusader of Sentia on this would scratch that itch and relieve Sega fans of the hefty price tag that the original cartridge goes for. One of the downsides feels almost petty, as the box it came in is less practical than the other boxes on this list, so if you unpack your console, it may be hard to pack it back in, which just hasn't been an issue with the Nintendo counterparts. It seems like not much until you need to transport it and you find you can't close the box. But I am just being picky at this point. This year saw the mini console release that I was least expecting, the TurboGrafx-16 Mini. Konami put this collection together, and unlike all the other consoles, the games are universal no matter what region you're in. You can choose either the TurboGrafx-16 or the Japanese PC Engine version, with some overlapping games, but many that were exclusive to Japan. The North American market gets the better deal since the PC Engine was much more successful than its North American counterpart, so there were far more Japanese exclusive games than the other consoles. This collection has many TurboGrafx staples like Blazing Lasers, Dungeon Explorer, Newtopia 1 and 2, Alien Crush, East Book 1 and 2, Bonk's Revenge, Air Zonk, and lots more. When you switch to the PC Engine, you get a few other classics like Bonk's Adventure or PC Genjin, Fantasy Zone, Bomberman 94, and a bunch of others that I dare not try to pronounce. The big winner here is the Castlevania game Rondo of Blood, which is a much sought after game and one of the best regarded Castlevania games in a beloved series. While this is by far the biggest collection of games for a mini console at 57 games, unless you speak both Japanese and English, you won't be able to play them all, as the PC Engine games have not been localized. This isn't always a huge deal because many of the games are shoot-'em-ups and have very little text and are easy to pick up and play regardless, but other games like Snatcher are text-heavy, and so you're out of luck. Regardless, this is a fantastic collection and going for about $100 US. This is a steal given how much more expensive collecting for the TurboGrafx is these days. Not to mention that some of these games are from the Turbo CD add-on, which adds more cost to a collector of the original copies. It's not a perfect package though. A strange item missing from this is a proper power adapter for you to plug your console in for power. You can find a compatible AC adapter, but you should have to pay attention to what kind it is. So the manual says you want a 5V 2.0A for the power. Some people have used 5V 1.0, but really pay attention because some people have accidentally bricked their minis because of using the wrong power supply. So do some research before you plug it in. And that to me shouldn't have been an issue in the first place. Another problem is that it only comes with one controller when many of these games are multiplayer, with some up to even 5 players. And while there is only the one controller, it has enough cord for 2. I guess they heard the criticism of the NES Classics cord and decided to overcompensate. It is the least complete feeling package as you need to source out the power supply, another controller, and potentially a turbo tap for more controller access, though the last one is only if you really want to go hardcore. It is noticeably bigger than the other mini console, so it doesn't save you as much space as you might think. The menu and the interface is my favorite, with the large pictures and the ability to select whether you want the TurboGrafx-16 or the PC Engine games. The TurboGrafx music is the best of all the menu musics, and we get lots of visual embellishments to really complete the experience, like the games being plugged in by HuCards or by CD. These flourishes really push the console to the next level of touching those nostalgic sweet spots. Exiting games in play is done simply by pressing both the run and select buttons simultaneously. One of the downsides of the console is lack of retail availability, partnering exclusively through Amazon. I prefer to have lots of different retail options and not rely on a single store and limited quantities, like Sega had done with their mini console, because it would stop the price gouging that you would see regularly on eBay from scalpers. Still, I can't argue with the game selection and the overall quality of its interface. The nuts and bolts make this one of the best mini releases I've seen. Alien Crush is a great choice as it is a fantastic pinball game, but it is a shame that the less common and arguably better Devil's Crush didn't make the cut. It's also strange not to see the legendary Axe games, if not both then at least the first one, as it was an important launch release for the system. Strangely absent is Keith Courage in Alpha Zones, the original pack-in title for the system. While it's not an amazing game, it seems like one that most old-school TurboGrafx-16 fans would be very nostalgic for. And I would have appreciated the third Bonk game because it's a late release for the console, and now a very expensive game to purchase. And even though there are plenty of shooters on this console, Gate of Thunder's absence feels like a huge oversight. But given the large game selection, I feel greedy for asking for too much more. Okay, so we're gonna actually have a look at the numbers of how much these carts cost on their own and how much that cost totals and how much that is versus, of course, the actual mini console. I got these numbers off of pricecharting.com. Now that's where you can just put in the name of a game and it'll tell you how much it is in the market. I find that their numbers tend to be very conservative and they actually tend to cost a little bit more when you actually find them in the wild, but it does give you sort of a general outline as to which games are particularly valuable and which ones are super easy and cheap to find. So even though I am Canadian, I am using American dollars just because I think most of my audience is American. It also just fits with all of the other numbers that I put out already about how much the mini consoles go for, so I may as well keep it consistent. None of these are complete in box or anything like that, which drastically increases the value. So this is sort of the bare minimum of if you just got the cartridges, not counting the NES hardware. Since this is an update video, I want to quickly put in the numbers of my original video from 2020, just so you can have a quick look at them, and we'll see how much the price has increased now that it is 2024. There still aren't a lot of heavy hitters on the NES Classic, although it is worth noting that in general, most of the games went up in price. The heaviest hitter is still Donkey Kong, now at $35, but interestingly enough, the next highest is Balloon Fight now at about $34, so those two are comparable. The cheapest one is still Super Mario Bros. At $6. That is the Super Mario Brothers and Duck Hunt combo because that's the one you're most likely to find in the wild. And there is nothing tied with that since Dr. Mario went up to about $8. So good job, Dr. Mario, you graduated. So that means that if you get all these games together, it gives you a total of $572, increasing at over $100 in value. So you saved about $500 if you got the NES Classic at retail value. So next we're going to take a look at the Super Nintendo Classic, and here's the 2020 numbers right here, and here are the 2024 numbers. It is worth noting that some of these did increase by quite a bit, and some did not, which is interesting. For example, Super Mario RPG was one of the heavier hitters before, but actually hasn't gone up in value, perhaps because of the remake. But Super Metroid, on the other hand, has increased a lot in value, and is now more expensive than Super Mario RPG was. The cheapest on here now is Street Fighter 2 at $13, having actually gone down from $17. The cheapest ones used to be F-Zero and Star Fox, but those are pretty close to their previous prices, having gone only up by a few dollars, and now Donkey Kong Country is tied with them, having gone down actually to $15. And Super Mario World is also at $15. So there you go. Some great games for good prices. But by far and away, the biggest price increase is Earthbound, which is clearly ramped up in popularity and collector's value, having jumped all the way up from $160 to $344. That, to me, is outrageous. This makes the increase of the SNES Classic $998, propelled very much by Earthbound. So if you got this at retail cost, you're saving quite a chunk of change. Okay, so here are the 2020 numbers on the Sega Genesis Classic and how much those add up to. in general, prices have gone up, but there's actually a few that have gone down, and now Sonic Spinball is not the cheapest cartridge anymore. And now Columns is down to $4. It actually went down in price, so nobody's out there hunting for Columns. What is interesting is that Mega Man The Wily Wars has increased significantly, and now $375, making this by far and away the heaviest hitter on here. Another thing is Monster World 4 has actually gone down in price significantly. From $127, it is now $66. Perhaps that's because it has gone to some modern platforms, and that just has decreased the demand, or I don't know what. But at least with Mega Man The Wily Wars, there is an alternate option, a more recent release, so people can buy that, although since that was in limited quantity, that's not cheap either, but it's much cheaper than the original cartridge at $375. It's still an official version, so that might be what I would go with. So with all these new numbers in place, the total of the Genesis has gone up from $1,041 to $1,281. So getting to the numbers of the TurboGrafx 16, this one is a little trickier because a lot of these games I couldn't even find on pricecharting.com because they aren't released in North America at all. When I couldn't find them there, I did go to eBay to see if I could find copies there and just sort of did my best to get a general, very vague number of how much they were going for, usually on the more conservative side of things. So the ones that are charging a lot, there are sellers who are charging way more than what I put down. I also did not include double games, so if Newtopia 1 and 2, I didn't do the Japanese version alongside the English version, I just went with the English version. I also went with the English version of some games like the Kung Fu, which was China Warrior. And again, this is just the hue cards. This is not counting all the packaging and stuff like that, except for a few of these which seem to only be available with packaging. So again, that sort of weighed into why this is the number I am the least sure of. This is also not counting any of those CD add-ons or region adapters or anything like that. This is just the games. Here's the original in the 2020 numbers for all the TurboGrafx and PC Engine games. This one is a little more interesting because while there have been some price increases for a lot of the TurboGrafx games, a lot of the PC Engine games have actually gone down in price, which I was not expecting to see. The cheapest is still Jiseken Necromancer at $5, and Momoratsu Densetsu 2 at $8, which is actually cheaper than it was before. So like I said, some of the PC Engine prices have gone down. Castlevania Rondo Blood even has gone down a bit from $250 to $217. So not a significant decrease, and it's still a hot ticket item, but it's not by any means the most expensive on here. In fact, Soldier Blade has surpassed it, going all the way up to $288. I actually managed to find a copy of, forgive me here, Genji and the Heike Clans at $135 on eBay. I don't know if it's going to sell for that much, but that's how much it's going for since that one was not on pricecharting.com. And Ginja Fuke Densetsu Sapphire, this is of interesting note in that it has gone down from being over $1,500 to just $760. So it's still a very expensive item. It's still the most expensive item on here, but that's a pretty significant decrease in value. So that actually means that the total estimate, especially from that one decrease, has gone down from $4,852 to $4,131. So as you see, it doesn't change the fact that the TurboGrafx 16 Mini is a great investment and has a lot of amazing games, but it is interesting just to see from a collector's perspective how the market has changed in just 4 years. So those are the numbers. Also, something I noticed here is that there are actually only 2 game franchises to get representation on every one of these mini consoles, and that's Castlevania and Ghouls and Ghosts. Not really sure what to add to that, but it was just an observation. So should you get these mini consoles, and which ones should you get? If you just like collecting these mini consoles, then yes. Just yes. If you have all of these consoles and all of the games you want to play, then you may not need to unless the save states are a big selling point. If you're looking for a fast and easy way to play a handful of retro games and you don't really have most of these games, then yes. If you are an OG console purist and emulation offends you, then no. These are not 100% perfect, there is some delay in the sound effects and sometimes even the input, but that's just by a few frames. The average gamer will not notice or care, but you know who you are if that sounds like a deal breaker to you. Chances are that if you want to try new games, you'll have the most luck on the TurboGrafx 16 Mini and maybe the Genesis. The two Nintendo consoles are really the greatest hits, so don't expect tons of unfamiliar content on them. For me, I feel like they are all worth the money I paid for them at their original retail value. The secondhand market for the Nintendo ones, well, that I would hesitate on. I, as a rule of thumb, have no interest in feeding the scalpers. But keep an eye out for good deals. If you go just by the numbers of how much the games are worth, the obvious winner of these is the TurboGrafx 16 Mini, which has the most games and the best dollar value. But of course, personal favorites aren't based on numbers. Some people see more value in the nostalgia of the consoles and mainly want to play their favorites that they had when they were a kid. So which you want may depend on which console was dearest to your heart when you were growing up. On that logic, the SNES Classic would be my choice. But I'm looking for a lot of old games that I hadn't had the chance to play before. Based on the mix of familiar games and ones that I've been eager to play, my favorite of these consoles may actually be the Genesis Mini, but it is a tough call. Each of these are full of retro gaming classics and will demand hours of your time, and were clearly made by people who wanted to preserve a collection of games that helped make each of these consoles special. A year and a half ago, Sega released the Sega Genesis Mini 2, reviving some interest in the mini console market after it seemed like the hype for these consoles was dying down. When I released my collection of mini console reviews a few years ago, some commenters were curious about my thoughts on the PlayStation Mini. I originally brushed it off, but there was enough interest that I started to feel like it was a mistake to dismiss it originally. So here's my mini console breakdown part 2, where I have a look at 3 more mini consoles and what their game collections are worth and how they hold up. These are the less popular options, but maybe you'll find out about a release that appeals to your tastes here. Again, this is a review of the consoles as they are at market, without any modding or extra games added. If you wish to mod them, that's your choice, but that's not what we're reviewing here. Sony's divisive PlayStation Classic was released right at the tail end of the mini console market boom. Loaded with a mere 20 games, they were really counting on quality over quantity with this collection. Yes, the Super Nintendo Classic also only had 21 games, but those games were pretty much all stone-cold classics and nothing was worth cutting out. I honestly can't say the same thing about the PlayStation Classic. Battle Arena Toshinden is a sluggish fighting game, Cool Borders 2 is an okay snowboarding game, Destruction Derby is difficult to control. My first impressions were not promising, and I didn't really have much fun until I hit Final Fantasy VII, where it wound up being quite compelling. Its inclusion was a no-brainer since that's the most iconic RPG from that era. Unfortunately, it's the PAL version of the game, so it has a worse frame rate than the one released in North America. I wouldn't have known that just from playing it myself, since I didn't play the game as a kid, but if you know the game well, you may be able to tell the difference. Games like Grand Theft Auto, Resident Evil, and Rainbow Six have frustrating controls and haven't aged very well, or maybe they would play a lot better if they included the DualShock controllers. As it is, having to steer the default method here feels more trouble than it's worth. And man, it's unbelievable how far Grand Theft Auto has come since this first very rough game. Metal Gear Solid is another landmark title that I'm glad made its way on here, though I really suck at it and may need some time to learn the ropes at it before getting very far. Other great additions are Tekken 3, which is a far better fighter than Battle Arena Toshinden, and Twisted Metal, which is another memorable title from the library. Ridge Racer 4 is also a solid racing game and far more playable than Destruction Derby. And the games I had the most fun with though were Mr. Driller, Super Puzzle Fighter, and Rayman. These may just be playing to my taste, but I find the pixel-based art styles much easier to look at over the very basic polygon characters of many of these titles. Intelligence Cube, Oddworld, Abe's Odyssey, and Jumping Flash all seem like good games, but I need to figure out how they work before I can properly give my thoughts on them. There are a number of games that's exclusion is mind-boggling. There are iconic titles that are defining titles on this platform that are nowhere in sight. While I understand the issues with licensed music that may prevent games like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater from being on this mix, it's hard to deny that it was an important game for the platform. Gran Turismo's absence is a particular shame given that it's the best-selling PlayStation game of all time. Also, there's no sign of Spyro the Dragon, Crash Bandicoot, Tomb Raider, nor Parappa the Rapper. and no Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which is a shame because that game helped redefine the franchise and also put the Vania into Metroidvania. How none of these made it onto this console is unbelievable. I understand that these franchises cost money to license out, but that's the point of these mini consoles, is to have a fair representation of the library, and this selection doesn't even come close. If Sony didn't want to dish out the dough, they shouldn't have even bothered. The physical console is pretty good. It resembles the original and the controller feels great. It has an HDMI cord and a USB cord and 2 controllers, but it doesn't actually have the power supply. Weird. It's a nice touch that it starts with the PlayStation logo and iconic tune, but the interface is pretty bare-boned. The menu has no music to speak of and nothing but a plain background with rotation of game cover art. It's not hideous or anything, but compared to the TurboGrafx Mini, which had so many fun embellishments in just selecting the games, this feels like a minimal effort put into it. There's no extra options like borders, which is fine because I don't often like the borders, or filters, which is a shame because some of these games might look better with a CRT filter applied. They might not look better, but we'll never know because it's not even an option. The basic features that have been on all other mini consoles just aren't here, so it really feels like this was just a cash grab on Sony's part to capitalize on the mini console craze. It was not received well at retail, especially at the $100 price tag. Soon it began to go on sale and hit bargain bin shelves, sometimes going down to $20. At that price point, it actually is not a bad deal if you have the shelf space for it. You can't really talk about this machine in 2024 without discussing the fact that it has a vibrant modding scene. Turns out this little beast, when put into the hands of fans, can be an emulating powerhouse, with some people adding hundreds of classic PlayStation games into their consoles. That seems to be the fate of this device, that it either decorates collectors' shelves or has been altered to the point where it no longer resembles Sony's original release at all. What will it be for me now that I've got one? I have yet to decide.
Sega Genesis Mini, the definitive mini console of the year. The next evolution has arrived. Reinventing the Sega Genesis with a new compact design. Sega Genesis Mini 2.
The Sega Genesis Mini 2 did a few things differently from its predecessor. This one by far has the largest collection of games at 61 and contains not only standard Genesis games but also a collection of Sega CD games. This was a great concept since the Sega CD catalog is generally very pricey in the collector's market. The unit itself resembles the Sega Genesis 2, so it's much more compact. The box actually took me by surprise with how small it is, but they did actually fit the unit, power supply, HDMI cable, and a single 6-button controller. Don't worry though, if you have the first Mini, the controllers of that unit are compatible with this one. The layout is much like the first Genesis Classic, though you could arrange them by release date, alphabetical order, or a few other options. You could choose borders for when you play these full-screen games on your widescreen TV, but of course what makes these mini consoles is the collection of games. Since this is the second in the series, many of these games feel like second-choice games, with many of the iconic titles having already been released. Fortunately, some of the more iconic games on the first one have great sequels. Golden Axe 2 is considered just as highly as the first game. ToeJam and Earl's sequel, Panic on Funkatron, is here as well as sequels for Earthworm Jim, Vector Man, and Thunder Force 3, the curiously titled Lightning Force. I admire the commitment to the typo. The big winners of this console for me are Ristar, a platformer made by Sonic Team in the late stages of the Genesis' lifespan, Herzog 2, a shooter strategy game that has a pretty strong following, and Crusaders of Senti, a solid Zelda clone that commands a high price for a physical copy. Alien Soldier is also a solid release, but has found its way into a lot of other collections already. I'm also really looking forward to playing the shooter/run-and-gun Ranger X, which is a late console release that sports some amazing graphics for the Genesis hardware. Desert Strike, Phantasy Star 2, Shining Force 2, and Revenge of Shinobi are all solid choices that really show the diversity of the Genesis library. Street Fighter II: The New Challenger is a superb port of the arcade game and puts to use the 6-button controller, but unfortunately there is only a single controller provided, so if you want to play with a friend with the standard controller, one of you will be at a disadvantage. I guess that really does mirror our experience as kids though, doesn't it? So points for nostalgia, right? Otherwise, it's a great addition. I was expecting a bit more from the Sega CD releases, but there are some choice selections on here. Sonic CD was a no-brainer and a worthwhile addition to this collection, and given all the different paths you can take with the time travel mechanic, the save states could make fully exploring this a much more manageable task for adults with limited free time. I'm also happy to see Sylpheed, a polygon-based shooter, and Final Fight CD, a loyal arcade conversion of a classic beat-em-up. The full motion video choices are fine because it was very iconic of the Sega CD back then, but Sewer Shark has not aged very well, and Night Trap has been ported to every console in recent years, most of which have much better versions than the grainy Sega CD version. That spot could have gone to something else. Many people were rightfully upset that the Sega CD Snatcher wasn't on here because the physical copy infamously commands a high price tag, and is one of the only localized versions of that game. And while having Echo the Dolphin CD version of the game here gives us perhaps the ideal way to play that game, it still feels redundant since the cartridge version was on the first Mini. So while many CD choices on here are solid, there are some missed opportunities as well. I would have also liked to see them maybe include some 32X games. Though I'm not too familiar with that library of games, this could have been Sega's first time releasing Knuckles Chaotix outside of its original release. The oddest additions are the bonus games in that there are a lot of them and most of them are not particularly noteworthy. Some of them look like an okay diversion, but a lot of it feels like padding. I just don't understand the need to release these games because I don't see them weighing much into a collector's decision to buy the console, nor does it speak to the nostalgic angle of the old school fans. But they're here, and there's not really any harm in that. What this console lacks in feeling like the total package as its predecessor did, it makes up for sheer quantity of games. Of course, one of the barriers of this console is accessibility. The first Genesis Mini was widely available at many retail outlets. It was no problem for me to get my hands on for myself, and even as a gift at one point as well. This one was an Amazon exclusive, but any market outside of Japan seemed to come as an afterthought. Even if you ordered it from Amazon.com, it would ship with shipping charges from the Japanese store. And there was no option for myself up in Canada, so my options were limited. I could have gotten it in the aftermarket from an overpriced eBay seller, but I am lucky enough to have a friend who lives on the other side of the border, so I can send packages to her and pick them up without too much hassle. But still, it's an extra step that shouldn't have been an issue. I don't like Amazon exclusives at the best of times, but double so when they basically tell me that my market isn't even worth their time. Personally, while I like this release and see a lot of value in it, I would have preferred a Sega Master System Classic, since that's a library that isn't quite as accessible to many people these days. I'm still holding hope that it will happen. The end of 2022 saw the release of the Atari Flashback 11 50th Anniversary Edition mini console. This is just the latest in a long string of dedicated Atari 2600 mini consoles, the 11th in fact. This gold edition is by far the most packed with games and peripherals. It's released by At Games, a very divisive company that has a reputation for cheap emulation and poor quality product. So much so that when Sega first announced their Genesis Mini was being developed by At Games, the backlash was so strong that they changed their minds and developed it themselves. And the Genesis Mini was a strong product in the end. But At Games has been making these Atari mini consoles for longer than it's been trendy, since 2004. Each one has had a different lineup of games, but with a fair bit of overlap between each release, making collecting each one completely unnecessary. If you get this newest gold edition, it comes with 130 games, or 110 for the standard edition. I have this newest edition and the 8th edition, and this latest one is more compact, sturdier, and much more appealing to look at. Not to mention it actually looks pretty accurate to the design of the console. If this product interests you, this is clearly the edition to get, even though it has a fairly steep price tag compared to the other mini consoles at around just over $100 American. How much you love it will depend on how much love you have for this era of gaming. A lot of people have trouble with games that are older than the Nintendo Entertainment System. Many of these games have that arcade quality in that they're relentlessly difficult and made to destroy you. Or they're very esoteric like the fan favorite game Adventure, which just throws you into the thick of it with no explanation. While it's easy enough to find walkthroughs or instructions online, mileage varies with games that look like this. There are some big hitters in the mix, like the popular Pitfall, which is one of the more approachable releases. I can't think of many games that are missing since I'm not overly familiar with the 2600's extensive library. But I do know it doesn't have Pac-Man, which was the best-selling game on the system. There are many reasons for that, but it's a notable absence. Though I know it's also not an overly well-regarded port of the classic arcade game, so no harm, no foul, I guess. I just suspect that some people are nostalgic for it anyway. I think this highlights how much of a revolutionary invention the D-pad was. The Nintendo controller, harsh as its edges were, was made to be so intuitive and easy to use. There's something about using the joystick that requires much more focus than a controller. It can be oddly tiring for long gaming sessions. I can't speak for the authenticity of how the joystick feels compared to the original since my exposure to the 2600 is limited and a distant memory. Same with the paddle controllers. They feel fine to me, I just can't say if they feel authentic. It's hard to dispute that at 130 games there is a lot of bang for the buck here. If you are nostalgic for this early era of gaming and love these games, this feels like an approachable and authentic experience and definitely the best one released by AtGames. On a strange technical note, for some reason, when capturing the footage and it was plugged into the capture card, there was no audio from the games on my TV. However, when plugged directly into my TV, the sound worked fine. So the average person's experience will not be affected by this, but if capturing game footage is your thing, just be aware of that. It's a solid way to play countless vintage home games, not lacking in a variety of titles. While I don't feel like it is for me, personally, I know that the Atari 2600 still has its fans to this day. If only a few of those titles interest you and you're more interested in using a modern console, you could purchase the Atari 50th Anniversary Collection and have a good portion of them, but only the ones developed by Atari themselves. Okay, so let's have a look at the games of the various consoles and take a look at how worth it, just on a monetary value, these consoles are. How much money you'd save buying the mini console versus buying this collection with an original PlayStation. I'm going with American dollars, since we've been talking about that for the most part. And for PlayStation, we're taking a look at it as if it was the game and the jewel case as well. Since with CD games, I find that most collectors will purchase the games with the jewel cases. So this is sort of a more realistic representation of what a collector would spend rather than with loose discs. Alright, so the cheapest of these games is Rainbow Six. Not too surprising since it has had a lot better sequels and I find this version almost unplayable. But we're looking at a lot of games in the $10 through $30 range. There are a few heavy hitters, particularly Jumping Flash, Resident Evil, and the big one of this collection is Revelations Persona. So based on those big ones alone, it does definitely wind up being monetarily wise to get the mini console, because all these games added up is a total of $1,022 compared to the $100 price tag. If you're just here for the games, it does actually make sense. As you see, there are a lot more games on the Sega Genesis Mini 2, and I had to kind of squeeze them in together. But that's okay, I'm making it work. These ones, it is worth noting that for the cartridge games, it's cartridge-only prices, and for the CD games, I was adding in the jewel cases. So even though that does make them more expensive, again, I feel collectors would be more likely to buy the CD games with their jewel cases. So, the cheapest game on here looks to be Desert Strike at $8. Next slowest is Populous at $10 and Sonic 3D Blast at $11. There is actually quite a wide variety of prices for these games, so there really isn't like anything too consistent. I put asterisks by some of the games that are not released in the North American region, such as Alien Soldier and Rainbow Island as Extra, as well as two of the CD games, Night Striker and the Ninja Warrior. Right off the bat, what makes this collection worth it 100% is Crusader of Senti, with the cartridge only selling for $550 typically. That even beats out any of the Sega CD games, where the next heavy hitter is, which is Shining Force CD at $216. And altogether, everything winds up being an approximate $2,938. This isn't even counting the price of getting the Sega Genesis and the Sega CD. So there you go. That makes this collection very much worth your while if you just want to play the games. For the Atari 2600, It's worth noting that there are a few games that I did not put on the list simply because they were previously unreleased prototypes, so they never had cartridge versions, so therefore you can't buy them. There's also a few cartridges that I could not find any information for as far as how much they cost, so I got a few question marks in there. This is just the first half of the games, or a little over half. But generally speaking, the Atari 2600 library is quite inexpensive, with one of the cheapest cartridges being Canyon Bomber for about $2. There's also several $3 games right off the top: Combat, Lock and Chase, Jungle Hunt, Laser Blast. So generally speaking, you can buy a pretty good Atari 2600 collection for very little money. You could just find a few of your favorite games and plug them in every now and then and play them. For this half, there are a few heavy hitters such as Aquaventure at $78, Beam Rider at $64, but the biggest one on this page is Hero at $107. Here's the remaining games right here. Again, mostly very inexpensive, but there are a few more expensive games, such as Wizard for $90 and Yar's Return for $62. But the single most expensive game on this entire collection is Sword Quest Waterworld at $211. But there are so many games that are so inexpensive that despite the amount of them and the few that are quite expensive, the collection does only wind up being about $1,700. So it still is worthwhile if you really want all of these games, or you just want a simple way to play them on your modern HD TV. But generally speaking, this is not actually as valuable a collection of games as the Genesis Mini. So those are my thoughts on this group of mini consoles. I feel like the first video had the stronger releases in general. Out of this batch though, I feel like the Genesis Mini 2 is the clear winner with a high number of games and mostly good quality releases, even if I and many others feel like it could have been better. The PlayStation Classic is a disappointment all around with fewer games than even the Super Nintendo Classic. Given the extensive library that they had at their disposal, there was no reason Sony shouldn't have put more content on here. There are some genuinely great games on it, but the presentation is lazy and inconsistent. It's no wonder that most of the units sold have basically been used as modded emulation machines rather than being enjoyed for their factory uses. Do with that information as you will. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it was informative and helpful to your mini console purchasing decisions. Which of these consoles is your favorite? Please let us know in the comments down below and we'll talk about it a little bit. Please like and subscribe, it goes a long way to helping the channel out. Happy gaming!